The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a mechanical heartbeat as Brooke Sullivan pushed through the staff entrance at Oak Creek Memorial, her faded navy jacket draped over her arm despite the July heat outside. 3 years. She'd been moving through these corridors for 3 years, and no one had ever asked her name beyond what appeared on the employee roster. That was exactly how she wanted it. The ER smelled like bleach and old coffee, a smell she'd learned to breathe through without flinching. She clocked in at 6:02 a.m., 7 minutes before her shift officially started. Early. She was always early. Early meant less time in the break room, less chance of conversation, less performance of the person she was pretending to be. Her son thought she'd spent her 20s doing overseas relief work in places with names she wouldn't say. She'd never corrected him. The lie was gentler than the truth, and gentler was what her hands needed at this point in her life, her hands that could now only find steadiness in routine, in charts, in the precise measurement of other people's suffering. She slipped into the supply room first, hanging the jacket on the hook in the corner where nobody ever looked. The faded unit patch was sewn inside the lining, pressed against the inner seam where it caught the light if you knew to look. She didn't look anymore. Her fingers found it anyway, the way they found the scar tissue on her ribs when she couldn't sleep at 3 a.m., the way muscle memory worked whether you wanted it to or not. 3 seconds. She let her hand rest there for 3 seconds, then released it and moved back into the corridor. The ER was already filling with the morning shift's quiet chaos, nurses pulling charts, residents reviewing labs, that low-level hum of institutional machinery waking up. Brooke moved through it like water, present but unremarkable, useful but invisible. She caught the tail end of the morning briefing in the nursing station, standing at the periphery while charge nurse Patricia discussed bed assignments and pending admissions. Patricia never made eye contact with her. Nobody did, except sometimes to ask about a patient's intake vitals or whether she'd documented the noon medication round. They spoke to her when they needed something specific. When she wasn't useful, she wasn't there. Sullivan, you're on trauma and intake today. Patricia didn't look up from her assignment sheet. We're expecting 3 post-ops from the surgical suite around 10 a.m. Understood. Brooke's voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that made people lean in slightly to hear it. Deferential. Small. She'd practiced it for 3 years until it fit like a borrowed coat. I'll have the beds ready. Good. Stock the 14-gauge angiocaths in Bay 4. Last shift didn't refill. Patricia made a note, already turning her attention to the next task. Thank you, Brooke. She was already walking toward the supply closet when the name registered. Brooke. Not Hey You, org the new one. Brooke. The name that existed in the system but had never belonged to her out loud in anyone else's voice. She didn't pause. Pausing would be noticed. The morning moved the way mornings at Oak Creek always moved, a series of small tasks clicking together like a mechanism that had been running for decades without requiring anyone to think about how it actually worked. A 52-year-old woman with suspected appendicitis. A construction worker with a laceration on his forearm that needed sutures. A teenager whose asthma had escalated during the night. Brooke moved between them with practiced efficiency, her hand steady as surgical steel, her voice carrying just enough authority to make patients believe she knew what she was doing while maintaining enough deference to keep her invisible to the doctors who actually made decisions. She didn't know when she first noticed Dr. Sterling watching her. He'd been working at Oak Creek for 15 years, a presence that had calcified into institutional authority the way certain structures calcify over time, not through competence necessarily, but through consistency and the sheer momentum of never having been challenged. He wore his status in the cut of his suits, in the way he held the attending's tablet like a scepter, in the casual way he'd dismiss a nurse's concern without reading past the first line of her chart note. He was, by the standard metrics of hospital hierarchy, someone who mattered. He was standing near the nursing station around 8:53 a.m. when Brooke passed with a stack of fresh linens for the trauma bays, and she felt the weight of his attention the way you feel a shift in air pressure before a storm. She didn't look at him. Looking at him would be a kind of engagement, and engagement was a trap. But she registered the moment he noted the way she moved, efficient, precise, the movement of someone whose muscle memory had been trained by something other than nursing school. She registered it and let it pass without acknowledgement. "Brooke." His voice came from behind her. "A moment." She turned, the linen still in her arms, her face arranged into the expression she'd perfected, attentive but not ambitious, present but not presumptuous. "Yes, doctor. You've been here 3 years." It wasn't a question. He was reviewing her like he might review a chart, looking for patterns that didn't add up. "I've noticed you tend to exceed the scope of standard floor nursing sometimes. The way you handle critical patients. The depth of your assessments." "I follow protocol, doctor." Her voice remained steady, each word placed carefully. She'd learned long ago that fewer words were always better. "I make sure nothing is missed." "Right." He studied her for another moment, and she could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, not quite suspicion, but the beginning of it, the seed of a question that would grow if she gave him reason to water it. "Just remember. Your job is data collection. The assessment belongs to the physicians. Clear?" "Clear, doctor." He turned back to his tablet, and she continued to the trauma bay. But something had shifted, a subtle realignment of his focus. He'd seen something in the way she moved, in the way her hands had assessed that construction worker's wound, noting not just the laceration but the client's blood pressure, the slight pallor around his eyes, the tremor in his voice when he'd spoken about chest tightness that had nothing to do with his arm. He'd seen her gather data that suggested a story beyond what the patient himself was reporting. He didn't like nurses who saw too much. By 9:15 a.m., the ER doors rolled open for the first patient of the scheduled pre-op screening series, and Brooke was halfway through restocking the medicine cabinet when the wheelchair came through. The man in it was older, maybe mid-60s, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades giving orders instead of taking them. Colonel Marcus Webb. The name appeared on the intake form before she saw his face, and something in her chest did a thing she hadn't permitted in 4,847 days. His daughter Sarah wheeled him into the triage area, speaking softly about the abdominal pain that had started 3 days ago, mild but persistent, something about possible gallstones, routine pre-op screening before they did the surgery. The words came in the register of someone reciting information for the 20th time. Brooke watched from her position at the medicine cabinet, knowing she should move, should step into the routine she'd perfected, should assess vitals and chart the presenting complaint like she'd done for 3 years without incident. She didn't move for 3 seconds. The face was older now, heavier at the jaw, deeper lines around the eyes, but the eyes themselves hadn't changed. The same eyes that had looked at her during that final briefing in Kandahar 4,847 days ago. The same voice, though softer now, as he spoke to his daughter about the pain, trying to minimize it, the way soldiers always did. He'd been the commanding officer. He'd been the one who'd pulled her from the field when her hands had stopped working right. He'd been the one who'd told her she could walk away from it all, who'd looked at her with the kind of understanding that only came from knowing exactly what she'd seen, and he'd said, "Go home. Raise your boy. Let someone else carry the weight for a while." She'd followed that order for 3 years. Now he was sitting in a wheelchair in her hospital, complaining of abdominal pain that would probably turn out to be nothing, just routine pre-op screening before the surgeons took out his gallbladder and sent him home with pain medication and a recovery protocol. Routine. Just another case file moving through the system. Except when she finally walked over to the triage station and took his vitals, her hands remembered everything. His blood pressure was 158/94. Elevated, but he attributed it to the pain. His heart rate was 88, not tachycardic, just slightly elevated. His oxygen saturation was 97%. Normal on the surface. Everything on the surface said gallstones, said routine pre-op, said nothing remarkable. But when she took his blood pressure again, a technique she performed without thinking, muscle memory from training that hadn't been part of her nursing degree, she felt what she shouldn't have been able to feel, the subtle distension of his jugular veins. Just barely there. Just barely. And when she placed her stethoscope against his chest to listen to his heart sounds, she heard something that shouldn't have been there. A murmur. Faint but unmistakable. The kind of sound that suggested fluid accumulation around the heart. The kind of sound that suggested something was pressing on his cardiac function, restricting the movement of blood, and his body was compensating in ways that would only show up if you listened carefully enough. She lowered the stethoscope, and her hands were perfectly steady. "Any chest pain, Colonel?" She used his rank without thinking, and his eyes met hers for the first time, and she saw the moment he recognized her. The moment his jaw tightened. The moment he understood that the Navy nurse taking his vitals was the same person he'd ordered home from Kandahar. "No chest pain," he said quietly. "Abdominal. Just what I told my daughter." "Shortness of breath? Any difficulty breathing when you exert yourself?" "No." But there was something in his voice now, a wariness. He was wondering why she was asking questions beyond the standard intake. He was wondering if she remembered that deployment, if she remembered what she'd done, if she remembered him. She finished the assessment in silence and transferred his information to the electronic chart. 2 minutes later, she found Dr. Sterling at the nursing station and placed the tablet in front of him, her voice low and deferential and carefully constructed. "Colonel Webb is ready for pre-op screening," she said. "I'd recommend a full cardiac workup before surgery. His vitals suggest possible cardiac involvement." Dr. Sterling was already scanning the numbers: BP 158/94, HR 88, O2 97. All technically within acceptable ranges. He didn't look up from the screen. Abdominal pain. Likely gallstones based on imaging. Blood pressures elevated because of pain. Nothing here suggests cardiac workup is necessary. The jugular venous distension and the cardiac murmur. "You heard a murmur." He said it the way someone might say you had a feeling. Like it was something personal and subjective rather than objective clinical data. Cardiac murmurs in patients this age are common. Benign in most cases. We don't order expensive workups on fishing expeditions. We follow the clinical presentation, and the clinical presentation is abdominal. He entered a note in the chart without looking at her: patient stable for routine pre-op clearance. No cardiac workup indicated. Floor assessment within normal limits. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, cataloging her concerns and dismissing them in the same gesture. "I'd still recommend." "That's noted." He looked at her now, and his eyes were the color of flint. "Your assessment is documented. My clinical judgment is that it's unnecessary. We're moving forward with the standard pre-op protocol. Is there a problem with that?" The room around them had gone very quiet. Not the kind of quiet that happens when people stop talking. The kind of quiet that happens when people stop breathing. Brooke could feel the attention of the other nurses and residents, the weight of a moment that was being calibrated by everyone in the immediate vicinity as either appropriate or inappropriate, professional or insubordinate. She took a measured breath. "No, doctor," she said quietly. "No problem." She turned and walked back toward the trauma bays, and she could feel him watching her go. He was trying to understand something about her, the way she'd asked those specific questions, the way she'd suggested something that went beyond the standard intake protocol. He was trying to file her into a category: overstepping nurse, ambitious floor staff trying to practice medicine, someone who needed to be reminded of her place in the hierarchy. He was wrong about that. But he would keep watching, and his wrongness would metastasize into something worse, something more deliberate. She could feel it beginning. The slow calcification of suspicion into something institutional. In the trauma bay, Brooke pulled a packet of sutures from the cabinet and began organizing the instruments for the next patient, her hands moving with a kind of precision that looked like muscle memory and felt like self-preservation. In her jacket pocket, against the ribs where the unit patch was sewn, her heart rate was starting to climb. She'd recognized Colonel Webb. And Colonel Webb had recognized her. And Dr. Sterling had seen her recommend something that went beyond the scope of floor nursing. She hadn't expected to see any of them again. She'd built a life in the margins specifically so she wouldn't have to see any of them again. But the margins, she was beginning to understand, were not safe. The margins had edges. And edges could collapse. Dr. Sterling stood in exam room 7 with Colonel Marcus Webb's chart open in his hands, the veteran's daughter Sarah positioned protectively beside her father's wheelchair. Sterling didn't look up from the papers as he spoke, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in every conversation. Routine gallbladder inflammation, some mild hypertension. We'll schedule the laparoscopic procedure for Thursday. He turned a page with deliberate slowness, already moving toward the door. Sarah nodded, relief washing across her face. The morning light filtered through the window and caught the edge of Sterling's Rolex, a gift from the hospital board 3 years ago, when he'd restructured the entire surgical department under his vision. The door opened. Brooke entered with her tablet, vitals printout in hand, moving with the quiet efficiency that had defined 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial. She'd learned early that invisibility was safer than ambition. "Dr. Sterling, I'd like to request a full cardiac workup before we proceed. Colonel Webb's jugular veins are distended, and his blood pressure is running lower than baseline, 88/56 this morning. His heart sounds are muffled." She kept her voice level, clinical. Just the facts. Just what the data said. Sterling's hand froze on the door handle. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing behind wire-rimmed glasses that cost more than Brooke's monthly rent. "Nurse Sullivan, when I require a floor nurse to practice medicine, I will specifically request it." He set the chart down on the bedside table with deliberate control. "Until that moment arrives, I suggest you confine yourself to blood pressure cuffs and bedpan management." The room temperature seemed to drop. Colonel Webb shifted in his wheelchair, his jaw tightening. Sarah's hand moved to her father's shoulder. Brooke didn't flinch. She met Sterling's gaze and continued, her voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "Doctor, those symptoms together suggest possible pericardial effusion. Muffled heart sounds with elevated JVD and hypertension, that's classic presentation. A simple echocardiogram would rule it out." Sterling stepped closer. His cologne, something imported, something expensive, filled the narrow space between them. When he spoke again, his voice dropped to a tone that made the words somehow worse. "Are you truly standing in front of this patient and his daughter, questioning my clinical judgment? After 3 years at this hospital, you believe you have the expertise to override a board-certified cardiac surgeon?" He paused, letting the question hang. "Or have you simply forgotten your scope of practice?" Sarah's face flushed. Colonel Webb's knuckles whitened against the armrests of his wheelchair. Brooke took one measured breath. The kind of breath you take when your body wants to react and your training demands you don't. A single tear escaped down her left cheek, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing something she couldn't prove, the frustration of watching someone dismiss data because the person delivering it wore scrubs instead of a white coat. She wiped the tear with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact, her hand steady, her voice quiet but carrying an edge like tempered steel. "I've seen what happens when we ignore the quiet symptoms, Doctor." "You haven't." Sterling's face flushed crimson. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned away sharply. "Thursday. 8 a.m. We're proceeding as scheduled." He walked out without looking back, the door swinging shut with a soft hydraulic hiss. The silence that followed was the kind that exists in trauma bays, in operating theaters when something has gone irreversibly wrong. Colonel Webb reached up and squeezed his daughter's hand. Brooke turned to leave, already mentally preparing for what she knew was coming. What she didn't expect was how quickly it would come. By noon, a formal typed notice appeared on the unit board in the break room. The font was professional, the language precise, all the more damaging for it. Personnel notice, formal written warning. Employee, Brooke Sullivan, RN. Date, today. Reason, overstepping scope of practice and insubordination in patient care setting. Dr. James Sterling reports that the above-named employee engaged in medical decision-making beyond the nursing scope, publicly questioned physician clinical judgment in the presence of a patient and family member, and created unnecessary alarm regarding routine preoperative assessment. This behavior demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of hospital hierarchy and professional boundaries. Further incidents will result in immediate suspension pending termination review. Signed, Hospital Administration. Her name in bold letters. Her alleged crime listed for every nurse, every resident, every staff member who passed through that break room to read and judge. Brooke saw it at 1:22 p.m. when she finally took her break after 6 hours of charting and patient care. She stood in front of the board for exactly 12 seconds, reading the words as if they might change on a second reading. They didn't. Around her, 6 nurses, people she'd covered shifts for, people she'd mentored, stopped mid-conversation. Gathered items. Stood up. Left. Not quickly enough to seem panicked, but deliberately enough to send a message. The break room emptied within 30 seconds. She sat alone at a table meant for 8, her untouched lunch cooling in front of her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like something dying. Through the small window in the break room door, she could see the hallway, the normal flow of hospital life, continuing as if nothing had happened, as if the rules had simply changed and everyone understood that Brooke Sullivan was now someone to avoid. By day 2, the pattern had calcified. Brooke entered the break room at 2 p.m. and watched colleagues find suddenly urgent reasons to be elsewhere. And for that needed changing. A patient call light. A phone call they absolutely had to take. No one met her eyes. No one spoke. The silence became its own language, a fluent vocabulary of professional exile. On day 3, Sterling made his real move. He found her at the nurses' station during change of shift, the busiest time, when medical residents clustered around reviewing charts. His voice came through bright and loud, dripping with sweetness that tasted like poison. "Ah, Nurse Sullivan. Perfect timing. I need someone to restock the bedpan supplies on the geriatric wing. Since you seem so eager to expand your clinical responsibilities, I thought you might appreciate the opportunity for, shall we say, expanded duties." He smiled. One of the residents smirked. Another turned away quickly, embarrassed for her. Brooke picked up her charting tablet without responding. She moved past him, not rushing, not slinking, just moving, and continued her work. Her composure was perfect. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice remained steady when she spoke to patients over the next 4 hours. But that night, alone in her car in the hospital parking lot, she gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles went white. That same day, Dr. Sterling made his first phone call. His medical school roommate answered on the second ring. They talked every Thursday evening about golf handicaps and investment portfolios. "Martin, I need a favor. We have a credential situation at Oak Creek. Nothing major, just need to be thorough." Sterling's voice was smooth as oil on water. A nurse with some questionable overseas work history. Vague documentation. Possibly concerning background. "We're doing a full review. Might help to have the board's attention on it, just as a matter of policy compliance." By that evening, the hospital's risk management department had flagged Brooke's file. By the next morning, she was called to a meeting in HR with an administrator whose name she didn't know and wouldn't remember, a woman with careful hands and careful words. "This is routine," the administrator said, not making eye contact. "We're updating all personnel files. We'll need comprehensive documentation of your work history, particularly the period from 2008 to 2013. Brooke felt something inside her collapse. 2008 to 2013. The date Sterling would have chosen if he'd known to choose them. The years she'd spent at Kandahar. The years that lived in a locked metal box in her bedroom closet, in a discharge certificate she hadn't looked at in 36 months. That work was complicated, she said quietly. International relief. "I'd need to make some calls." The administrator's expression shifted. Something like suspicion flickered across her face. "We'll need more than that, Ms. Sullivan. Dates, organizations, supervisory contacts, documentation of licensure in foreign countries if applicable." Brooke provided what she could. Her nursing degree from UNC. Her RN licensure. A carefully vague letter from an organization that technically existed and technically confirmed she'd worked there, but said almost nothing. The administrator's frown deepened as she read it. We'll be in touch. That evening, Brooke sat at her kitchen table with the lights off. Rain hammered against the windows like someone desperate to get in. Her son was at basketball practice until 8. She had the house to herself. She had silence. She had the weight of 3 years of anonymity crumbling apart because she'd had the audacity to be competent at the wrong moment in front of the wrong person. She pulled out the metal box from the back of her bedroom closet. It was smaller than she remembered. Dented at one corner. She'd put it away after the discharge paperwork cleared, after she'd convinced herself that Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan could simply stop existing, could become just Brooke Sullivan, RN, just another healthcare worker, just a single mother trying to sleep through the night without hearing the voices of people she couldn't save. Her hands shook as she held the box. Not from fear. From the understanding that the past, once it starts moving, doesn't stop. It builds momentum. It becomes unstoppable. She placed the box on the table without opening it. She wasn't ready. Not yet. But the box was now in the light, where she could see it. Where it could see her. And somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Sterling was making his third phone call, this one to the State Nursing Licensing Division, filing a formal inquiry about credential verification and professional background. The third phone call had already been placed by the time Brooke finished her charting at 11:53 p.m. Dr. Sterling sat in his corner office on the 4th floor, the kind of office that came with mahogany furniture and a view of Raleigh's skyline, and he was dialing a number he'd kept in his phone for 17 years. The connection took 3 rings. Marcus. It's David Sterling. Medical school, Duke, 1994. Yes, I know it's late. He paused, letting the silence work. I'm calling about a staffing concern. One of our floor nurses, Brooke Sullivan, has been demonstrating judgment patterns that are frankly alarming. I'm not saying she's incompetent, but she's making clinical assessments that are outside her scope. Cardiac workups. Advanced diagnostics. I'm wondering if maybe she's overselling her qualifications. Another pause. The voice on the other end of the line asked a question Sterling had been waiting for. I don't want to make accusations without due diligence, but her file has some gaps. Military background, I think. Sealed records. You know how that goes, people reinvent themselves in civilian medicine. Sterling smiled. The board member had just become his echo chamber. Within 18 minutes, the State Nursing Licensing Division received a formal inquiry about Brooke Sullivan's credential verification. The request came from an administrative phone line at Oak Creek Memorial, but the words came from Sterling's mouth, dictated to his secretary. We are conducting a routine review of clinical competencies and require confirmation of all specialty certifications and background clearance documentation for Brooke and Sullivan, RN, current employee. The inquiry was filed under routine due diligence. No accusations. No complaints. Just questions. Questions were seeds. Seeds grew into investigations. The next morning, Brooke arrived at 6:43 a.m. for her 7 o'clock shift and swiped her badge at the employee entrance. The light blinked green. The door opened. But something was different. She felt it before she understood it, the way certain hallways seemed to rearrange themselves, the way her name didn't appear on the posted assignments like it usually did. She found the roster pinned outside the charge nurse's station and her breath caught. Her name was there, yes, but reassigned. Not trauma bay, not intensive monitoring, not anywhere near surgery. She was assigned to the progressive care unit, lower acuity, stable patients, the kind of floor where nothing demanded quick thinking or advanced assessment. And beneath her name, a small notation, restricted access pending credential review. Do not assign to critical care patients. The charge nurse was a woman named Linda who had worked at Oak Creek for 9 years and had always been kind to Brooke in the way that busy people are kind, efficient kindness, not complicated. Linda looked at Brooke and looked away. Dr. Sterling left instructions this morning. Nothing personal, honey. Just what he's asking for while the review is happening. Brooke didn't respond. The words would have come out wrong. She folded the assignment sheet and walked toward the progressive care unit, her footsteps steady against the linoleum, her badge swinging against her scrubs like a metronome counting down something she couldn't stop. The fluorescent overhead lights cast everything in the same pale institutional white they always had, but today they felt like scrutiny. She was being watched. Not physically, there were no security guards following her down the hallway, no obvious surveillance, but the kind of watch that came from being discussed in offices and written about in files. They were documenting her. Building a case. She could feel the architecture of it even if she couldn't see the blueprints. By Tuesday, the case was taking shape. Dr. Sterling had spent his morning creating a detailed timeline of every clinical decision Brooke had made in the past 3 years that could be construed as overreach. He pulled her assessments on post-op patients, her notes on medication interactions, her documented concerns about protocol deviations. Taken individually, each decision was defensible. Taken together, laid out on a spreadsheet with dates and patient outcomes highlighted in yellow, they looked like a pattern of a nurse convinced of her own superior clinical judgment. Sterling had a gift for presentation. The spreadsheet was immaculate. The narrative was seamless. Pattern of escalating scope expansion, he titled it, and he sent it to hospital administration with a CC to the risk management officer. At 2:15 p.m. that same day, Brooke was checking vitals on a patient in room 417 when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, check your patient file access. Something wrong. It was from Jake Garrison, one of the junior residents who had always seemed friendly. She opened her hospital portal from the patient room's computer and felt her throat tighten. Her access had been restricted. She could no longer pull full charts on post-op patients. She could no longer access imaging results or surgical notes without supervisor approval. The restrictions had been applied at 8:41 a.m., hours before she'd even arrived. Dr. Sterling had been thorough. He was isolating her, removing her ability to see the clinical picture that was her actual job. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Colonel Marcus Webb's pre-op appointment was now scheduled for 3 days hence, Thursday at 3:56 p.m. The gallbladder removal was set for Friday morning at 8:48 a.m. with Dr. Sterling as the primary attending. Brooke knew this because she had memorized the surgery schedule weeks ago, tracking every detail of the patient whose commanding officer she had once served under in Kandahar, the man who had ordered her son's entire platoon through hostile territory and brought them all home alive. She had checked the surgical file that morning before her access restrictions took hold, and her blood had gone cold when she saw who was assigned as the anesthesiology resident, Derek Hutchins, 4th-year resident, 0 experience with cardiac complications, fresh out of his rotation in pediatrics. Derek was competent. Derek was not seasoned. Derek was exactly what Dr. Sterling wanted, someone too inexperienced to push back if something went wrong. The restriction from critical care was the trap inside the trap. Brooke was being kept away from surgery, away from rounds, away from anywhere Colonel Webb would need her judgment. And if something happened during that surgery, she wouldn't be there to see it coming. The voice on the intercom crackled overhead, a page for cardiology to report to the ICU, and Brooke finished taking the patient's blood pressure. The reading was normal. Everything in the progressive care unit was normal. Everything was fine. Everything was exactly where Dr. Sterling wanted it to be. That evening, Brooke sat in her car in the hospital parking lot and opened her laptop. She logged into the VA database using credentials she had promised herself she would never use again, credentials tied to a name and rank she had left behind 11 years ago. She pulled Colonel Webb's full military medical record. The discharge summary was 2 pages long. Blast exposure, 2012, Sanjin Valley, Helm and Province. Pericardial scarring documented. Follow-up cardiac clearance recommended annually. The last follow-up had been 2019. It was now 2024. 5 years without a cardiologist review. 5 years, and he was about to go into surgery with a junior resident and a doctor who had already decided his symptoms were hysteria disguised as clinical concern. Brooke closed the laptop and placed her hands on the steering wheel. Her palms were steady. Her heart rate was elevated but controlled. She had been trained to make decisions under conditions that would make most people freeze. She had held human lives together with field surgical skills that had taken years to earn. She had done things in Kandahar that she would never speak about, not to her son, not to anyone. And she had chosen nursing because she thought it would be quiet. She thought it would be safe. She thought she could be just a nurse. But Colonel Webb's name was on that surgery schedule. And she couldn't not see what she had already seen. She couldn't unknow what she already knew. She drove home at exactly the speed limit, watching the streetlights pass overhead like false stars, and when she arrived at her empty house at 11:23 p.m., her son was already asleep upstairs. She stood in the kitchen in her scrubs and held the edge of the counter and didn't cry because senior chief petty officers don't cry. They breathe. They think. They plan. The next morning, she called the surgical coordinator and asked a simple question: is Colonel Webb's cardiac workup complete for tomorrow's pre-op? The coordinator, a woman named Sandra, paused long enough that Brooke could hear the answer before Sandra even spoke. No workup was ordered, Brooke. Just the standard pre-op labs and imaging for the gallbladder. Brooke said thank you and hung up. She knew what she was going to have to do. She knew it would cost her. She also knew that the alternative was walking into work on Friday morning and standing in a surgical waiting room while something preventable happened to a man who had kept her son alive. The code alarm screamed overhead at 2:53 p.m. on a Wednesday. Code Blue, Pre-op Suite 7. Code Blue, Pre-op Suite 7. Brooke was in the staff locker room, hand steady as she cleaned out her personal items into a cardboard box, 3 years of 12-hour shifts compressed into the space of a showbox. Her hospital badge sat on the metal bench. Her parking pass. Her access card. Dr. Sterling had made the calls that morning, to the board, to licensing, to security. Administrative leave pending investigation. Don't come back until we've reviewed your credentials. The alarm was still screaming when she heard the overhead page confirm the location. Suite 7. The pre-op holding area. Where Colonel Webb had been scheduled for his gallbladder surgery at 3:15 p.m. She moved without deciding to move. Muscle memory took over, the kind that came from 8 years of combat medicine, from responding to a code alarm faster than thinking about consequences. Her legs carried her down the hallway, through the ER, past the nursing station where 3 nurses looked up in surprise to see a nurse on administrative leave running toward the surgical wing. Security tried to stop her at the pre-op suite doors. Brooke didn't stop. The room was chaos in the way that rooms go silent. The monitor screamed in a frequency that seemed to come from somewhere inside her chest, a high, panicked electronic wail that meant the patient's heart had already decided to leave. Colonel Webb lay seizing on the surgical table, his body rigid and jerking, his face the color of slate. The anesthesia resident, young, maybe 26, with the kind of eyes that said this was the worst thing she'd ever seen, was calling for the crash cart. Dr. Sterling stood frozen at the bedside. His hands hung at his sides. His mouth was open. Brooke saw the vital signs on the monitor in the same way she'd once read a battlefield in Kandahar: distended jugular veins like cables straining under pressure, hypertension spiraling, BP 70/40 and dropping, O2 sat 68, heart rate 142 and climbing. Muffled heart sounds. The clinical picture painted itself: pericardial effusion. Cardiac tamponade. The fluid around his heart was compressing it like a fist closing, and in approximately 90 seconds, Colonel Webb was going to die. "Step back," Brooke said. "Who the hell?" Sterling started. Brooke had already moved. She grabbed a spinal needle from the procedure tray, 14 gauge, long enough, perfect, and positioned herself at the subxiphoid angle, the soft space just beneath his ribcage where the needle could slip through the pericardium without perforating the heart. Her hands moved like a metronome, each motion a space where thinking had no room to exist. The needle went in. The feel of it pushing through tissue was information, pain was data, and the data said she was in the right place. She drew back the plunger. Blood filled the syringe. Red. 30 milliliters. 40. 50. 60. The pressure released like air escaping from a punctured tire, that hiss, that perfect sound of internal pressure becoming external, balance returning. Colonel Webb gasped. Color flooded back into his face like someone had turned up the saturation on a photograph. The monitor's wail shifted, dropped, steadied. BP climbing, 80/50, 95/60. O2 sat climbing, 72, 78, 84. Heart rate dropping from 142 to 110, then lower, stabilizing into something that approximated the rhythm of a human being who wasn't about to die. Sinus rhythm. The monitor settled into the steady beep of a man still alive. The room went dead silent. Dr. Sterling's face cycled through white, then red, then something darker, the kind of rage that comes from watching power slip away in real time. His voice, when he found it, sounded like it was coming through gravel. "What the hell did you just do?" Brooke met his eyes. Her voice dropped lower, steadier. "Pericardiocentesis. Cardiac tamponade. You would have watched him die in 2 minutes. You don't have authority to." "He was dead." Brooke set down the syringe with the precision of someone placing a live round. "I made him alive. You can file complaints after his stable." Sterling's hand was already on the phone mounted on the wall, his movements jerky with fury. He was dialing before he'd even finished reaching for it. "Security to pre-op 7. Now. I want this nurse removed from the building immediately." The next voice that came through the overhead speaker wasn't human. It was institutional authority, calm and procedural, security responding. ETA 2 minutes. Brooke didn't move. She didn't turn away from the monitor. She watched Colonel Webb's oxygen saturation stabilize at 94%, watched his heart settle into a rhythm that meant survival, watched the anesthesia resident stare at her with the kind of expression that comes from witnessing something that rewrote everything she thought she understood about the hierarchy of a hospital. Sterling hung up the phone. He wasn't looking at Brooke anymore. He was looking at her like she'd become something incomprehensible, a shape in the darkness that his mind couldn't quite catalogue. "You're suspended. Effective immediately. Your credentials are under review. You will not come back to this hospital until the board determines whether you're even allowed to practice nursing." Brooke watched the monitor for another 8 seconds, just long enough to confirm that Colonel Webb's vital signs were trending in the direction of living. Then she turned and walked out of the room with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. Security was waiting in the hallway. 2 officers, one of them the chief, a man named Holloway who'd always been kind to her, who looked genuinely pained. "Brooke, I'm sorry. Orders from administration." "I understand," she said. They walked her through the ER like an escort, past nurses who suddenly became very interested in their monitors, past residents who whispered once they thought she was out of earshot. The cardboard box from her locker seemed to get heavier with each step, though she knew it weighed the same, a small plant she'd brought from home, 3 thank you cards from patients, a photo of her son taken 6 months ago. Within 2 hours, an emergency review board was convened on the 3rd floor. Sterling made the calls from his office, voice tight and controlled now, the fury replaced by something more dangerous, the focused determination of a man who understood he needed allies if this narrative was going to survive what it had just witnessed. Call 1, to his medical school roommate on the hospital board. "We have a serious credentialing issue. A floor nurse just performed advanced surgical procedures without authorization. Her background is sealed. I want an external investigation." Call 2, to the State Nursing Licensing Division. "I'm reporting a scope violation with significant patient safety implications. I have documented evidence that this nurse has specialized tactical medical knowledge that exceeds her credentials." Call 3, to hospital security. "Clear her locker. Confiscate her badge and credentials. I want her out of this building within the hour." By 3:24 p.m., Brooke was driving through rain that hammered the windshield like applause, still in her scrubs, the box of her professional life sitting on the passenger seat next to her. She didn't know if Colonel Webb had made it to surgery, didn't know if the fluid would reaccumulate, didn't know if the decision she'd made had saved his life or just delayed the inevitable. What she knew was that she'd walked into that code room knowing it would end her career. She'd done it anyway. Her 15-year-old son came home from school at 4:15 and found her at the kitchen table, still in her scrubs, staring at the rain outside the window. Mascara had dried in tracks down her face. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the kind of trembling that comes from adrenaline having nowhere left to go. "Mom." His backpack hit the floor. "Why are you home? Why are you crying?" Brooke looked at her son, this boy who'd grown up while she was trying to become invisible, who'd never asked about the nightmares or the empty stares or the way her hands sometimes moved on their own when something triggered the memory of blood on concrete, and the only words that came were the truth. "Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything," she whispered. He sat down across from her without saying anything else. "Just Saturday. Just stayed." The kitchen filled with the sound of rain, the ticking of the clock above the refrigerator, and the kind of silence that meant he was learning something about his mother that would change how he understood her forever. 3 days later, the hospital board would convene for Brooke's termination hearing. Colonel Webb would be wheeled past the conference room, awake now, recovering. He would see her through the glass. And he would mouth a single word that would make everything that came next possible. But that wasn't what mattered yet. What mattered was that Brooke Sullivan, Senior Chief Petty Officer, retired Special Forces combat medic, had chosen a floor nurse's salary and a son who deserved a mother without secrets over the career she'd already sacrificed everything to rebuild. And she would make that choice again. The federal agent stepped through the conference room doors like a change in air pressure, 3 of them in dark suits, one carrying a leather folder thick with documents. Agent Marks was the first to speak, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "Dr. Marcus Sterling." He stood, confusion flickering across his face. "I'm going to need you to sit back down." It wasn't a request. It was a command. The hospital board members exchanged glances. Brooke's attorney straightened. Sterling's face cycled through emotions like a faulty monitor, confusion, then anger, then something that looked a lot like panic. "What is this?" "I have a termination hearing to conduct." This woman violated protocol, overstepped her scope. Agent Marks opened the folder. "You contacted the State Nursing Licensing Board on October 14th at 2:08 p.m. and filed a complaint claiming Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan had fabricated her credentials." She held up a printed email chain. "You knew that information was false. You knew exactly who she was. And you filed it anyway." Sterling's attorney stood as one. Their hand went out, palm forward, a physical barrier between their client and whatever came next. But Sterling couldn't stop himself. Words tumbled out like he was hemorrhaging. She was insubordinate. She overstepped. She performed a procedure without authorization. She performed an emergency pericardiocentesis, Agent Marks interrupted, on a patient in acute cardiac tamponade while you stood frozen. 60 milliliters of blood from the pericardial sac. You know what happens without that needle. Colonel Webb dies on the operating table. Your operating table. The silence that followed was the kind that comes before something breaks. "There's more," Agent Marks continued. "You access sealed federal military databases without authorization. You attempted to contact the Pentagon to verify her discharge status. You altered her hospital personnel file, added performance complaints that were never documented, never witnessed, never occurred. You fabricated evidence to justify her termination." She set another document on the table. "That's wire fraud when you use hospital email systems to transmit false information across state lines. That's obstruction when you attempt to destroy evidence. That's retaliation under Title VII, and that's a federal crime." Sterling's face went the color of old bone. His mouth opened. Closed. His attorney whispered something urgent in his ear. Sterling pulled away. "This is ridiculous. I was performing my duty as chief of surgery. I have the authority, you have the authority to manage your department," Agent Mark said, "not to destroy evidence of your own incompetence." She nodded to her colleague. The agent stepped forward with handcuffs the color of pewter. "Marcus Sterling, "You're under arrest for wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and evidence tampering." The click of the cuffs was louder than it should have been, sharp as a gauge needle hitting steel. Sterling started to protest, his voice rising in pitch with each word, cycling between indignation and desperation. "You don't understand. She violated protocol. She acted outside her." The agents led him out. His protests echoed down the hallway and faded like a siren moving away. The hospital board sat in a state of collective shock. One of them looked toward the door where Brooke had been waiting. "Bring her in." A visiting nurse from the VA stepped forward instead, a woman named Patricia Chen, herself a former Navy corpsman from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Her hands trembled as she opened a folder marked Declassified, 2024. She cleared her throat. "This is Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan's operational record from 2009 to 2017. Combat medical specialization. She deployed 3 times to Kandahar province with JSOC task force elements." Patricia's voice steadied. In 2011, she performed emergency surgical interventions on 14 military personnel in active combat situations with 94% survival rate. Above standard. Way above standard. She looked at the board. Bronze Star for Valor under fire. 2012, the room absorbed that. Bronze Star for meritorious service. 2014, Patricia set down a photograph, Brooke in desert camouflage, her jaw set like iron, blood on her sleeve. Not her blood. Purple Heart. 2013, shrapnel from an IED detonation. She was treating a wounded Marine when the explosion occurred. She stayed with the patient. Continued the procedure. Finished saving his life before allowing medical evacuation. The board member closest to the door had gone pale. Patricia hadn't finished. The door opened, and a man in a Navy dress uniform stepped through, Lieutenant Commander Jake Holloway, SEAL Team 3, his presence filling the room like water finding every empty space. He moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had operated in complete darkness for a living. "I know Brooke Sullivan," he said. His voice was low, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "I've worked alongside her in Kandahar. In 2012, during Operation Enduring Freedom, her forward operating base came under sustained mortar fire. RPGs, automatic weapons. Active engagement." He paused. The room held its breath. That day, she performed 11 field surgeries. 11. Under fire. Interrupted twice by direct combat. She kept operating. Kept saving lives. One of those surgeries was on Colonel Marcus Webb, 82nd Airborne, who was brought in with a penetrating thoracic wound and acute cardiac tamponade. He looked directly at the board. She opened his chest in a tent with rounds coming through the canvas. She performed a resuscitative thoracotomy with the same technique she used in your hospital last week. She's the reason Colonel Webb is alive. She's the reason he was here for a routine gallbladder surgery. She's the reason he's still here. The second FBI agent, the one with the declassified file, stepped forward. His credentials identified him as Special Agent David Reeves, assigned to counterintelligence. "I verified Brooke Sullivan's military service with the Pentagon directly. Her discharge paperwork is classified at the secret level due to the sensitive nature of her operational assignments. That's not a rumor. That's not speculation. That's federal record." He set a sealed document on the table. Dr. Sterling's attempt to access those sealed records, his filing of false complaints, his fabrication of personnel documentation, all of it triggered an automatic flag in the federal system. Oak Creek Memorial has been under investigation for 14 days. Dr. Sterling's actions don't just violate hospital policy. They violate the Espionage Act. He tried to discredit a cleared military operative using false federal filings. That's not a personnel matter. That's a national security concern. The hospital board administrator went gray. Agent Mark spoke again. "Dr. Sterling is being charged with wire fraud, obstruction of justice, retaliation under federal employment law, and unauthorized access to classified military records. His medical license will be suspended pending trial. His bail hearing is tomorrow morning. She paused. And in case it matters, Colonel Marcus Webb, the patient he tried to keep Brooke away from, has been conscious for 3 days. He's in the hallway. He asked to be here when we brought in the warrant. The agents escorted Sterling out in handcuffs, his protests still echoing. The board members sat in paralyzed silence. Then someone moved toward the door. Patricia Chen stood. Jake Holloway stood. Agent Reeves gathered his documents. And through the glass wall of the conference room, visible now in the hallway beyond, sat Colonel Marcus Webb in a wheelchair, his military bearing intact despite the surgery, despite the 48 hours of being in critical condition. His eyes met the glass. He raised his right hand in a crisp salute, though it clearly cost him something, the pull in his wound, a moment of pain that he conquered with sheer will. The room erupted. Not in applause, something more fundamental. Something like the sound of institutional weight shifting. Something like justice finding its center of gravity and holding. 18 months later, Brooke was walking through Ridgeline Shopping Center with her 15-year-old son when she saw the folding table near the food court. Dr. Sterling sat behind it, wearing a suit 2 sizes too large, his hair grayed at the temples, his smile practiced like a salesman's mask. Supplemental insurance brochures were arranged in neat stacks. Affordable coverage for every budget, the banner read. His eyes came up as she approached, automatic, the dealer's reflex. Then recognition. His smile cracked like old plaster. He looked away first. Brooke kept walking, her son's hand in hers, and neither of them looked back. 6 months after the federal hearing, Oak Creek Memorial unveiled the Wall of Honor in its main atrium, a space of polished marble and soft lighting where military service was documented, acknowledged, made visible. The hospital administrator stood before the staff and spoke about the importance of recognizing sacrifice, of honoring those who had served in uniform. Brooke stood in her scrubs, back on the ER floor, back in the place where it had all begun, back saving lives without apology. Colonel Webb was there in his wheelchair, his daughter Sarah beside him. The administrator read names aloud. When she came to Brooke's name, the room went quiet. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, United States Navy. Special Forces Combat Medical Officer. 3 operational tours. 2 Bronze Stars. 1 Purple Heart. Service in Operations Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom. Sarah stepped forward holding a small fabric patch, faded from years of being hidden inside a jacket lining. The same unit insignia, a Valkyrie with wings spread. The same design that Brooke had carried against her ribs like a secret heartbeat for 8 years. Sarah pinned it to the wall beside Brooke's name and rank. The staff erupted in applause. Brooke's son stood beside her, tears streaming down his face, finally understanding why his mother sometimes woke screaming at 3 a.m., why she'd chosen every single day to keep saving lives anyway, why she'd been willing to lose everything rather than abandon a patient. Colonel Webb raised his right hand in salute. Brooke returned it, and there was no tremor, no hesitation. Just recognition. Just honor. Just the simple acknowledgement that passed between soldiers who had seen the same dark things and survived them. That evening, her son sat across from her at their kitchen table, the same table where she'd fallen apart months before. The locked metal box from her closet sat between them, now open. Her medals gleamed under the overhead light, the bronze and purple and steel catching the kitchen fluorescence. Her son picked up the Purple Heart, turning it over in his hands with reverence usually reserved for holy objects. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. Brooke was quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that contains years. "Because I wanted to be just your mom. Not a hero. Not a warrior. Just a mom." Her son set the medal down carefully. "You've always been both." Brooke smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. A smile that didn't carry weight, didn't carry burden. Just joy. On her first day back on the ER floor, a new policy memo had circulated through Oak Creek Memorial, drafted by the board and signed by the hospital administrator. Any medical professional could request a second clinical opinion or request additional testing without fear of retaliation, formalized in writing, enforceable by the board with consequences for violation. 3 nurses had already used it. 5 more had sent quiet inquiries about the policy scope. Brooke kept the faded patch on the wall of honor where Sarah had pinned it, but she no longer needed to hide the one that had lived inside her jacket. She wore her military service pin on her scrubs now, visible to everyone, no longer invisible. The closing image was Brooke walking through the ER at dawn, the sun streaming through the windows in long gold bars, her shadow stretched across the tile floor like a memory made visible. She moved toward the trauma bay where a new patient was being wheeled in, and her hands were already moving, already knowing, already saving. Her voice when she spoke was the voice of someone who had nothing left to hide and nothing left to prove. 12 lead EKG. Blood type and cross. Get me a cart. It wasn't a request. It was command from someone who had earned the right to give it. The team moved in perfect synchronization, and Brooke Sullivan, Senior Chief Petty Officer, moved with them like she had never left, like she had always belonged exactly where she was. If you ever find yourself dismissed by someone who underestimates you, remember that the quietest people in the room sometimes carry the heaviest medals. Subscribe for more stories about the hidden warriors walking among us. Like this video if you believe in standing alone for what you know is right. Comment below, what would you have done in Brooke's position? And if you want to see more stories about people who refuse to be invisible, hit that notification bell. Because sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns.